Professor Isaacs, if I could start with you, because we're speaking to you because this week your organization, who do such important work and have done so for such a long time, you released a study that you did looking at new research by the Institute on the impacts of COVID-19 responses on South Africa's food system. And in reading the statement, there was one statement that really just was quite chilling, and it was from your partner, Professor Hall. And she said that the state of disaster was clearly more disastrous for some than for others. Under COVID-19, it has become quite evident that increased production and profits in the food system can be accompanied by greater food insecurity and hunger. And really, we're talking today about how more and more people are happy to get vaccinated. We're talking about 475 new cases, 47 deaths. Our numbers are way low. The country is ready to move forward. We're voting on Monday. And yet, so many South Africans are still trying to put food on the table. They're finding it more difficult to do so than they did before the pandemic. People are still out of jobs. Women have left the workforce in their numbers as a result of the pandemic. And these people can't just move on. It's impossible for them to do so. If you can give us just a base of what your major findings were in this survey, Professor Isaacs.
Thank you, Marcel, and it's a pleasure to speak to you on this forum. So our first important findings that we found was that, there was a huge lost part of the food system was particularly closed, and this is focusing on because of the lockdown, and particularly the informal food system. Although small-scale farmers and small-scale fishers were seen in terms of fresh produce and fresh fish, they were seen as essential services. But due to school closures, quite a lot of the fresh produce did not have a space to sell their food because the school feeding schemes take a lot of the fresh produce. And also small-scale fishing was sitting with oversupply. The lockdown also closed in terms of market. A lot of the small produce and small-scale fishers actually use bucket trade, and the bucket trade could not transport because of permit requirements. It was a particular and that had a tremendous impact. So that resulted in particular stresses and shocks where we have oversupply and surpluses, and it was very difficult for small-scale farmers and fishers to be able to get rid of their surpluses due to these restrictions. So what they tried, they lowered their prices, and to such an extent, for example, in small-scale fishers, where that's the area where I particularly work in. Small-scale fishers, there was an oversupply in terms of when hard lockdown reached in April 2020, and there was an oversupply of snook in Lambert's Bay. But small-scale fishers could not sell these fish, and the government made an agreement with fishing companies, and fishing companies bought these highly nutritious food for cheap, and they stored it until they could profiteer later. And small-scale farmers basically sell their fish for, their produce for lower prices in terms of competing with commercial farmers. And Ayanda will also highlight that particular cases. There were also mitigation in terms of the government grants. Particularly production grants were given to small-scale farmers. Small-scale farmers were given vouchers, and these vouchers were specifically for input costs. A lot of the vouchers were delayed. These vouchers were given to specific companies to buy specific things, and that is not necessarily what the small-scale farmers needed. And also the seeds were, we heard that some of the seeds were also GM seeds. In terms of small-scale fishers, nothing, no support, only a little bit of a food parcels once off. and a lot of community soup kitchens, and a lot of hunger. So we didn't particularly follow the hunger in this study, but we followed to what extent these lockdown measures impacted on small-scale fishing and farming. One important finding was the difference we found in tracing the statistics. We looked at the food price inflation, and then we also compared that to the consumer price inflation. So from March 2020, we saw that the inflation of food prices started to rise, and from March 2020 up to now, we see that the rise in food prices is much more than the food prices, than the inflation, consumer inflation prices.
Okay, so and I think we've seen that number continue to go up. Professor Isaacs, if I can just bring Ayanda in here now. Ayanda, thank you so much. She's been standing by for us in Pietermaritzburg. We've got the foundation of the research done by Professor Isaacs and the team at PLAS. You are a field worker for the Association for Rural Advancement. So the findings of that study you've seen for real in your day-to-day work. And I'm particularly interested in what you have observed in the people that you've worked with and the impact of COVID-19, particularly for our small-scale farmers, and with specific mention of our black farmers who already had a problem with a lack of capital, a lack of access to distribution, and the list goes on. What did you find during these almost 2 years now of this lockdown was the major impact of COVID-19 for those farmers in particular?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and good evening to everyone. In terms of small-scale farmers, I think it is similar to what Professor Isaacs has mentioned. They mentioned that there was an increase in prices for agricultural inputs, which affected the way in which they worked because they could no longer afford to buy them. They mentioned that the prices had doubled from what they used to sell or to buy. And my particular interest, or what I found very interesting around small-scale farmers, was on market access. So small-scale farmers did not only have a challenge with access to markets, but they also lost some of the market that they had already identified and created connections with. Mainly, one is the Bakkie traders. They had links with Bakkie traders, who are the main buyers of their produce, and because of curfews and the permits, they could no longer go to the small-scale farmers to buy that produce. The other one is around the closure of schools. Small-scale farmers that were interviewed mentioned that they were supplying their produce to the local schools, but because of the closure of schools, they could no longer sell those produce to the schools. I think, yeah, that's the highlight. I think also it is worth mentioning that one of the small-scale farmers mentioned that he identified the fact that the land that he was using suddenly became small as the demand for food at a local level was increasing, while the land available for him to produce or to provide at a local level became very small. He also mentioned something along the lines of lack of access to water. He mentioned that their local municipalities having a challenge giving them access for water to drink. So access for water for their produce is much more a challenge. Yeah, so yeah, those are the highlights.
as with many things in this country, the brunt of the impact of COVID-19 is really carried by women. I mean, we saw statistics showing that a high number of women left the workforce as a result of COVID-19. In your experience in the rural areas, in your capacity in the Association for Rural Advancement, what has been the impact both on women running households, providing for their families, and also women farmers or those in the farming and fishing and trading industry? In your experience, Ayanda, what has been some of the stories that you've heard there?
The farm workers that we interviewed mentioned that apart from the challenges of COVID, they've also had to deal with having to restructure the way in which they provided food or look into prioritizing other needs at a household level. She mentioned that she pays rent at the residence that she lives in. She also has to pay for water as well as electricity. And the money that she earns within working as a small-scale, not a small-scale farmer, but a farm worker, also impacted negatively because it's not enough. It is bare minimum. She earns about 1,000 rand a month, and she still needs to provide electricity, to pay for rent, and also to give transport money to her children as well as grandchildren. It just shows that COVID, over and above the challenges that farm workers have to deal with, impacted much more negatively on the work that they do, as well as having to sustain their livelihoods.
Professor Isaacs, quite telling there, that a first-person experience that Ayanda's been able to give us there. Women also make up a large number of our informal traders. So not only are they the ones that had to cut the amount of food and quality of the food that they were buying for their families because there just wasn't enough food going around, many of them are dependent on being informal traders, on providing food on the streets of their areas and the various communities across the country. And it's not so long ago that we carried stories about informal traders being sometimes forcibly removed from the streets because they didn't have the fancy paperwork that so many of our bigger food providers were able to access as instructed by government.
Marcel, we must remember that in South Africa we are not kind to informal traders, and if we look at the sector that we are specifically talking about, there are 2.5 million people that are working in the informal trade, whether it is street traders in cook food and selling food. There are about 750 people who are working in terms of street trade, selling fresh produce. We're talking about 250,000 small-scale farmers, 80,000 small-scale fishers. The stats is quite alarming when we look at the numbers, and also we are really accounting to what extent this group of people are providing food for a number of people that are not going to the supermarket. Suddenly, they were not, as you were saying, they were not allowed to trade, and a lot of the consumers went to the supermarket. Interestingly, that the supermarket is in a contained space where there's no fresh air to purchase. Also, small-scale traders would sell, we have evidence, and especially in the Johannesburg fresh produce market, where they also get their products from, what they sell the products for is 70% or 100% cheaper than what you would get in the supermarkets. So they are almost cushioning the price for the lower income, while the supermarkets and the big retail are just creaming off the profits when it comes to the food. And we saw what in terms of the dividends of the big supermarket chain, more particularly ShopRite and Tiger Brand. So the food processing and retail are making the money, and these street traders are being harassed in terms of the permits, in terms of regulations, in terms of bylaws. And I think when we come back to local elections, we should put this in on top of our agenda, how we treat street traders that provide this food, provide food for so many of our low income and poor people.
Okay, Professor Isaacs, thank you so much. That's all we have time for, but a very important discussion that hopefully won't go away anytime soon. And we will hopefully see the nuance that's so desperately needed in government policy when it comes to this kind of thing in the future. Thank you so much. That's Professor Moniba Isaacs. She's the research leader with the Land and Agrarian Studies, or PLAS Institute at the University of the Western Cape. And then, of course, also from Pietermaritzburg, we were joined by Ayanda Madladla. She is a field worker with the Association for Rural Advancement, doing very, very important work there as well. Ladies, thank you so much for your time this evening.